So the degree of complete policy failure we can expect out of China should be catastrophically entertaining. And I think we're seeing that now in things with the food system and the electricity system. We're probably going to see it with the port system here really soon. The thing is, we don't know what he's going to do because he doesn't know what he's going to do because he's not getting good information. So the people are saying that, Putin is talking to the voices in his head. There's some truth to that, but for the most part, there is a cadre. They are intelligent. It's just not a lot of people. With Xi, there's no one. So predicting what the Chinese are going to do is kind of an exercise in futility.
I see.
And there's really nothing else that the Russians can give the Chinese. The Chinese have already reverse engineered all their weapons. The pipelines to China are already running at full capacity. The rail system is already running at full capacity. The only other way to get more stuff would be if you loaded at a Russian western port, say St. Petersburg or Novorossiysk, which is their shallow ports, their small boats. Then somewhere at sea, you transfer the cargo from a small vessel to a larger one, sail it around Africa because you can't use Suez, all the way to China. So, you're just the cost of that, the logistics of that, getting around insurance companies and shipping companies, they'd have to charter everything themselves, insure everything themselves, and running routes that are 4 and 5 times as long as all their other supply routes are. So just the volume of stuff that you might be able to increase to Beijing is just minuscule. So all that is left from the Chinese point of view is, how long is Russia a useful distraction away from people ganging up on China? Because on day one of this war, the Chinese were really, really excited. Because they're like, oh my God, this is going to show just how weak the West is. This is going to show how Russia can take an entire country and walk away with everything that it had before. And that is just so false now. And the Chinese know that if they try something on Taiwan, they are far more vulnerable to the sanction packages that the United States has now led than the Russians are. Because at the end of the day, the Chinese still import roughly 80% of their energy and 80% of the inputs that allow them to feed their population. So if you do something like we've done against Russia, against China, not only does the Chinese system collapse in a matter of months, they've lost 500 million people from famine within a year. And they now know that. So the nationalist chest beating that we've been seeing more and more and more has gotten very circumspect. And they're just focusing on amplifying the Russian propaganda on Chinese news stations because they really don't know what else to do, because they're seeing 50 years of strategic planning the Russians have torched in a month. The biggest hit that we would feel from the American side of things would be in tech manufacturing, because that's all been outsourced to East Asia. But very, very painfully little of the value add is done in China. There's much more done in the rest of the Asian countries. So I'm not suggesting that we would walk away and not feel the difference. Like iPhone has, for example, completely doubled, tripled, and quadrupled down. Anytime there's been a problem with China, they put in more money. Stupid will cost them the company in the end, but it's really the only company that's gone that far. For everybody else, when you're talking about electronics and widgets and telephones, it's going to hurt. But that's the only sector. And there's nothing about the technology that is required to do that we can't do in the Western Hemisphere, with the exception of low-end semiconductors. And I'm kind of counting on Vietnam to fill that gap because they're moving up the value-added scale so quickly, so much faster than the Chinese did. But aside from that, food, no. Energy, no. Tech, no. Finance, we'd probably actually get a huge surge, just like we did after the Asian financial crisis. So in most sectors, there would be disruptions, but it would be even short-term gains for the American market. But in electronics and computing manufacturing, that is where we would feel it. That's unavoidable. Actually, all manufacturing as a component of trade is less than 2% of GDP. Remember, only about 15% of US GDP total is involved in international trade.
I did not know that. Okay, well, wow.
The single biggest sector of that 15% is energy. And not necessarily imports. It's like the United States, Canada, and Mexico import and export among them. That's counted in that number. And then the next biggest part will be manufacturing, again, in and out of Mexico and Canada. So if you remove the NAFTA economies, and if you remove energy from the math, you're really talking less than 5% of GDP for everything else combined. You may remember back to the Mexican-American War, we took half their territory, and that's still smarts.
Okay, I understand.
So there's
that.
always been this strand in Mexican political thought, which is hard to deny, that the Americans can't necessarily be trusted. And we've not always been the best of neighbors. in the ideology as it evolved during the Cold War, that meant when the United States created the globalized order and everyone joined it in order to get economic goodies and security protection, Mexico didn't, because they still didn't trust us. So it wasn't until the tequila crisis of 1995, and the negotiation of the NAFTA Accords, which, thank God, Canada convinced us to bring the Mexicans into that. So 1995 is kind of the magic year when the Mexicans really took it seriously and started integration. And since then, they've become our largest trading partner. And I'd say, are fast on their way to becoming one of our fastest friends. That's kind of the first big piece. The second big piece is Mexico, from a topographical point of view, is not like the United States. So, we'll have like a regional city, let me just pick one out of the air, Des Moines. And it's surrounded by a series of suburbs, and then beyond that, small towns. Because, it rains in Iowa, and so you have farms and you have townhouses and small towns. It doesn't rain in northern Mexico. It's desert. And so you've got a series of isolated population communities, and in a pre-integration NAFTA system, that made education really difficult. Because, you might have an island of educated people, but then nothing else for hundreds of miles. That makes it really hard to do value added. Taking some sort of raw material and turning it into an intermediate product, or taking that intermediate product and adding value to it and including it into a larger material. So steel into wire, spark plugs into a carburetor unit, that kind of thing.
Okay, gotcha.
So 1995 is really when the Mexicans started on that path. And since they didn't have the tech or the capital, it was up to Americans to come into Mexico, set up factories in league with local Mexican workers and bigwigs, and produce. Now, the Mexicans since then have taken it and run with it. It's one of the best the best modernization stories we've got. But they still are limited by those pockets of population. And so they don't have any of them that are large enough with a big enough cadre of skilled labor to do something like high-end electronics. There just isn't a national or regional history of large-scale precision manufacturing. So the US does the high-end chips. Thailand and Malaysia do the mid-level chips, and China does all the low end. But no one in North America can take that from China because we don't have the labor structure for it.
Gotcha.
Ours is too well skilled, and the Mexicans are skilled differently. In the United States, we only make 11% of the world's chips by number, but we make 60% by value. So if it's going into a high-end phone, if it is going into a laptop or a server, that is definitely an American chip, or maybe from Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan. If it's going into your car or your plane, something where it doesn't have to be nearly as small because you've got some room to work with, that's probably out of Thailand and Malaysia. And if it's your blender singing when you've pureed to a certain level of consistency, that's definitely out of China. Think of it this way too. If you've got a high-end chip, let's say you are in China and you've got a dozen people who can break it down, hack into it, figure out how it was put together, and come up with the plans to do it. Well, it's 12 dudes. You now have to educate 250 million dudes. There's a scale issue. And China does not have an education system that generates people capable of creative thought in sufficient numbers to engage in a French-style industrial espionage economy. The French could do it because they've been doing this for a very long time. And it's a sticking point in the relations with everyone. But with the Chinese, they came from a low base, and their education system promotes obedience and memorization. And while there are roles for that in any economy, when that is the definition of your workforce, it's just really hard to move up the value-added scale. And even if tomorrow the Chinese invaded Taiwan, conquered it without destroying it, and they just walked into TSMC, they couldn't operate those facilities. They'd just be paperweights. So this idea that China is this technological marvel that's going to take us over, it just ignores basic math, which I also find amusing that it's an American argument.